Okay, the epoxy is dried now. It's actually the next day, so it's nice and hard. And I need to get the wood flush with the brass. There's several ways to do this that I'll talk about here. One is to take some sandpaper on a block. This works best if it's glued down, and basically work at that until it's flush. That works pretty well. The downside is as you're sanding this, you're sanding the end of the brass here, and it's easy to overdo it. I mean, if you do it that way, you really want to kind of push on the wood and work it. So that works, like I said, it works okay, but the way I like to do it, that just because it gives me more control, I'm going to take a plane, I'll clamp it in the bench, and I'm going to go back and forth like that. So, the brass is rubbing on the sole of the plane, it's not cutting anything, and I'm really just cutting the wood. And I can get pretty darn close to that. I don't want to get so low that I'm cutting into the brass, because it will cut the brass. So I'll go to it's almost there, and then I'll finish it on the sandpaper. I've got my plane in my face vise, and I've set it for a relatively aggressive cut. And I should point out that when you clamp a plane in a vise, you want to clamp it pretty low. You want to make sure you're squeezing fairly close to the sole. If you've got it up too high, you might bend the side flanges on the plane enough to where you could break them. This metal on these older planes is pretty brittle. I've already started this. I've got it somewhat close there, and I'm just going to continue. And I'll feel, and you can kind of watch how the epoxy's disappearing here. And if your plane has much crown, you could maybe go to the outside. Well, not sure that's really working, but so you could go to the outside and get a little less shaving. There you can see I hit the brass there, so you want to be careful you don't do that. There's a high spot. So I'll continue doing this till it's pretty much even all the way around. It's pretty flush now, and I'm just finding there's a couple spots where the wood feels a little bit high. So I've got this turned around. I'm kind of catching on the wood there. And just hitting these last few high spots. You can see there where I went too far. So that's about as close as I'm going to get it. I'll sand it the rest of the way. I've got my sanding block in the vise here, and I'm just going to sand this, and I want to go until obviously it's flush. You want to be a little careful. It's easy to put fairly big scratches in the brass. It's not super hard. And just like with other things, it's going to be hard to get those scratches out. So go easy and go until you're just done. What you really want to avoid is tapering this so it's smaller at this end than here. It just looks funky if you do that, and you're losing some of that surface area. So you can see I'm just scratching the brass there a little bit, so I'll continue. So notice as I'm doing this, I'm always turning it as I'm moving it. If you don't turn it, you're going to get a flat spot. So once this is flush, I'll switch to the next grit. I've got a bunch of different grits here, and I'll get this nice and smooth up to about 400 grit. So I've got this nice and flush now. It feels flush all the way around. I don't see any unsanded spots, right next to where the wood is. So I'm ready to go to the next grit. So on this next grit, I'm of course going back and forth, but I'm turning it more slowly now, because on the coarser grit, I was turning it fairly quickly, which puts scratches at an angle. So now I'm just kind of slowly turning it as I go here, because I want the scratches more parallel. So that's looking good. Next grit. At some point, it doesn't make sense to be sanding something round on a flat surface. So I've got some sandpaper here, just a quarter sheet folded in thirds, 320 grit, and I'm now just as with sanding, trying to get out the previous scratches. You can see it's starting to look a little more consistent here. So once again, I'll continue to do this up through 400, maybe 600, and then we'll take some Scotch-Brite to it, and that should finish it up. I said a minute ago that I was going to use Scotch-Brite, and I remembered it's a little tricky to get Scotch-Brite to use for this. There's different colors and they have different grits. The gray is fairly fine, but there's two grays, and I think this is actually the coarser gray. The white is not abrasive at all. It's really more for polishing. And then there's a light gray, and then the maroon is next. That's going from finest to coarser. So I'm not going to use this. Instead, I'm going to use a 4/0 steel wool. And that actually kind of polishes this up nicely. So you can, take it to whatever level you want. Keep in mind that if you just leave the brass bare, after a while, it's going to get this darker patina, this kind of aged bronze, which I think looks nice. Nothing wrong with that at all. It kind of hides some of the flaws and things. And of course, it's going to get beat up when you're using it. The other option, which I had tried on this one, this is just a regular brass hammer that I made without the wood head. On this one, once I got it polished up with the steel wool, I took some spray lacquer and lacquered it, just one light coat, and that keeps it from oxidizing. So this one has stayed looking a little brighter, and like I said, personal preference. I actually kind of like the look of this, particularly with the wood, but it's up to you. So I'll go ahead and polish this up. Now I actually don't want to get too carried away here, because the next thing I'm going to do is get these ends squared away. I'll drill a hole in it, so I'm going to beat it up a little bit more. So I don't want to get too carried away with the polishing quite yet. When we're using the hammer, we're, at least on the plane, we're either hitting the back of the plane here, or we're hitting the blade. Now notice the back of the plane is round. It's not a flat surface, but the back of the blade is flat. And one thing to think about when you're hitting something with a hammer, you don't want to hit a flat surface on a flat surface, because the only way it's going to work is if those two surfaces are perfectly aligned. Otherwise, you're going to hit, if say the hammer was flat, as I come down on something that's also flat, I'm going to hit one corner. I'm not going to get a fairly solid blow in the middle. So if I'm hitting something flat, I want the surface to be a little bit rounded. If I'm hitting something curved, it can be rounded or flat. So I tend to just round both, although I round the metal side a little more than the wood side. To round the end of the metal part here, really about the only way to do it without using any special tooling is to just rub it on some sandpaper. And I don't know if it shows up there, but if I do this enough, I'm kind of putting pressure on the side there and rotating. And I just want to create just a slight crown there. Now, a much easier way to do that, if you have the equipment, is with a lathe. So I've got a 4-jaw chuck, and I can put this in the chuck of the lathe, spin it, and then I can just take a file and do that. And of course, that's much easier. It's much easier to get it symmetric. It goes much more quickly. So either way you do it, you just want a slight crown on there. Put maybe a slight one on the wood too, although it's not as important. I'm at the lathe, and I've got the head chucked in here. I've got some tape on here so I don't leave marks on there. And I'll go ahead and spin this up. So I'm just filing at a slight angle there, and get a little bit of a crown. So I'm just, not that much of an angle, but I'm kind of doing that. So if I hold the file flat against there, I'm seeing maybe a 64th gap at the edge. That looks good. I'm going to hit that corner just a little bit. I don't want a sharp corner there. Now I'll take some sandpaper. Now when I was filing on the top part because I want to be cutting into it. Now that I'm just sanding, I'm just going to do it on the bottom half. So once again, I'll go through the grits, finish with the 4/0 steel wool, and then I'll turn around and do the wood end just a little bit. I'm finishing with the 600 grit paper, then some steel wool. As long as I've got it in the lathe, I brought it out a little more so I can just clean up this whole outside surface. So I'll turn it around and do the wood end now. So on this end, I'm only going to use sandpaper. So I've got the end done. I'm just going to polish up the rest of this. So that looks great. Next up, we need to drill the hole through the head for the handle tenon to go through. So the hole's going to be 3/8, and of course we want it centered on there. So I've got a jig here that has a couple of holes in it. So we're not going to use this one. That's for 3/4 inch diameter stock. This is 7/8, so it'll slide in here. This dimension is about the same as the head, so we'll center the head in there and rotate it the way we want to rotate it if you have a preference. And then I've got a drill bushing here so we can use the jig multiple times, and we'll put a little bit of lubricant in there and just drill right through the head, put that 3/8 hole in there. I've got the jig clamped to the table here so that the bit goes right down in the hole. I've got my head in there. Now there was a couple of little dings on there, so when I put the head on, I want to make sure they're facing down. So I've got them aligned this way. Got a little bit of machine oil here. I'm going to just put a drop on there, and we'll go ahead and drill this. Now, you don't want to be bashful with this. You want to just drill through. The brass isn't super hard. Don't be ginger with it, otherwise you just create a lot of heat. Now, when the drill breaks through the back side, it can push some of the metal out. So sometimes this one's coming out pretty well, but sometimes it gets a little difficult to pull out. That's working out fine. So that looks great. The last thing I need to do on the head is chamfer the underside where the tenon's going to go through. So I typically do this with a small jeweler's file, and I'll go in and file that. But I tried using my countersink, and that worked pretty well. It vibrated a lot. So you really want to slow it down and maybe even do it by hand, spinning it by hand. But I did put this in the hand screw clamp, clamped it, put something underneath it to support it, and then used the drill press to do that. So anyway, it's not something you have to do, but it just makes the head fit down a little tighter on the handle because we've got the 3/8 tenon here, and then there's this angled shoulder, and that just snugs up in there a little nicer. So once we've got the handle made and the tenon on the end of it, we'll go ahead and install the head.